Most people look at soil and see something simple, just dirt, something you plant into, something you water, something that either gives results or doesn't. It feels basic, almost too ordinary to question. If plants grow, the soil is good. If they don't, something must be missing. That's usually how it's understood. But what you're actually looking at is not just soil, it's a system, a living structure that depends on balance, movement, and interaction. And when that system stops working, it doesn't break in a way that's obvious. It doesn't collapse suddenly or give you a clear signal. Instead, it slows down quietly, gradually, in a way that's easy to overlook. You start to notice small things, but they don't seem connected at first. Water doesn't behave the way it should. Sometimes it disappears too quickly, slipping through the soil before it has a chance to do anything useful. Other times it just sits there, resting on the surface, not moving, not soaking in, as if something beneath is blocking it. You water again, thinking it will fix it, but the behavior stays the same. The texture tells its own story. The soil feels dense, tight, almost closed off. It doesn't break apart easily. It doesn't respond the way healthy soil should. When you press into it, it resists. It lacks that soft, open structure that allows everything to move freely. It looks fine from a distance, but when you interact with it, you feel the difference immediately. Plants react to this in ways that are easy to miss if you're not paying close attention. They don't fail dramatically. They don't always die or collapse. Instead, they grow slowly, unevenly, without strength. Our leaves don't carry the same energy. Growth feels limited, as if something is holding it back. You keep waiting for improvement, but it never fully arrives. And when this happens, the response is almost automatic. Add compost, add fertilizer, add something new, try to correct the problem by introducing more into the system. It feels logical. If something is lacking, you supply it. If growth is weak, you strengthen it from the outside. But this approach only works if the system underneath is functioning properly. Because what if the real issue isn't about what you're adding at all? What if the problem exists deeper in the way the soil is structured, in how it allows or blocks movement beneath the surface? The soil doesn't just need nutrients to work. Nutrients alone are not enough. It needs flow. It needs space. It needs a balance between air, water, and life. These elements have to move freely, interact naturally, and support each other. When that flow is present, everything works together. When it's missing, nothing works the way it should. Think about what happens when movement is blocked. Water can't spread properly. Air can't reach where it needs to go. Life beneath the surface slows down or stops responding. Everything becomes restricted. And once that restriction exists, adding more on top doesn't solve it. Well, it only layers over the problem. That's why you can add compost and still see no real improvement. You can apply fertilizer and still feel like something is off, because the issue isn't always about what's missing. Sometimes it's about what's preventing the system from functioning in the first place. This is the part most people never see because it's not visible. It doesn't stand out. It doesn't demand attention. It exists underneath everything else, quietly influencing how the soil behaves. And unless you understand that layer of the system, every solution you apply stays limited. Once you begin to see soil this way, your perspective starts to shift. You stop focusing only on what to add, and you begin to look at how everything is moving or not moving beneath the surface. You begin to understand that structure matters just as much as content. That flow matters just as much as nutrients. And that's where everything starts to change, because once you recognize that the system itself needs to be corrected, not just supplied, you stop trying to force results, and you start restoring how the soil actually works. There is one simple layer that most people overlook completely. Not because it's difficult to use, not because it requires special knowledge, but because it appears too ordinary to be important. It doesn't stand out. It doesn't look powerful. It doesn't resemble the kind of solution people are used to trusting. And because of that, it gets ignored. But this layer is not designed to impress you at first glance. Its value is not in how it looks. It's in what it allows the soil to do once it's in place. This layer doesn't work like fertilizer. It doesn't feed the soil directly, and it doesn't deliver nutrients in a way that can be measured or immediately seen. You won't notice a sudden burst of growth just because you added it. It doesn't operate on the surface level where quick results are visible. Instead, it works deeper, influencing the way the entire system behaves. What it changes is not the content of the soil. It changes the structure. When you place this layer correctly, something subtle begins to happen beneath it. The soil that once felt dense and compressed starts to separate, not all at once and not in a way that's obvious, but gradually Small spaces begin to form where there were none before. These spaces are what the soil needs to function properly, but they are often missing in soil that has become tight and unresponsive. As these spaces develop, movement becomes possible again. Air can pass through instead of being trapped. Water can move across and downward instead of being blocked or lost too quickly. The soil begins to breathe in a way it couldn't before. It stops behaving like a solid mass and starts acting like a living structure. When this is where the real shift begins, instead of water sitting on the surface or rushing through without effect, it begins to spread more evenly. It reaches deeper layers without resistance. It stays available longer without creating imbalance. Moisture becomes something the soil can hold and distribute rather than something it either rejects or loses. Air follows the same pattern. It moves through the soil instead of being shut out. This movement supports everything beneath the surface. The processes that depend on oxygen, the interactions that require space, the balance that keeps the system active. This layer acts as a connection point. It links what happens above the soil to what happens below it. It doesn't force anything. It simply creates the conditions that allow everything else to function properly. It becomes a bridge between the surface and the deeper layers, making sure that nothing is isolated or blocked. Once this connection is restored, the soil begins to respond differently. It no longer feels rigid or closed. It becomes more open, more flexible, more capable of adapting. It reacts to water, to air, to pressure in a way that feels natural instead of restricted. And with that change, balance starts to return. This balance is not something you add, it's something that emerges when the structure is right, when movement is possible, when space exists, when nothing is being forced or blocked. The system begins to regulate itself. It doesn't need constant correction. It doesn't need continuous input. It begins to work the way it was always meant to. That's why this layer is so effective, not because it adds something powerful, but because it removes the limitations that were holding everything back. Most people focus only on what goes into the soil. They think in terms of nutrients, additions, supplements, but without the right structure, those additions can only do so much. They sit on top of a system that can't fully use them. This layer changes that. It prepares the soil to function. It creates the environment where everything else can finally work as it should. It doesn't replace nutrients. It allows nutrients to move. It doesn't replace water. It allows water to spread. It doesn't replace life. It allows life to return. Instead of soil acting like a dense, unresponsive block, it becomes layered, open, and active. It begins to respond instead of resist. It supports instead of limits. And once that shift happens, something important becomes clear. You don't need to keep forcing results from the outside. You don't need to keep adding more to compensate for what isn't working, because now the system is working again. Nothing dramatic happens. That's the part most people misunderstand. And it's also the point where many lose patience. You place the layer, you look at the soil, and everything seems the same. No sudden change in color, no immediate growth, no visible sign that anything is working. It can feel like nothing has happened at all. But this process doesn't work on the surface first. It doesn't start where your eyes are focused. It begins underneath, where change takes time to become visible. That's why expecting instant results leads to the wrong conclusion. This isn't a quick reaction, it's a steady adjustment. The first noticeable shift begins with water. Before, water may have behaved unpredictably. It either moved too fast, slipping through the soil before it could be used, or it stayed on the surface, unable to penetrate deeper. Both situations limit how effective watering actually is. You may have added more water thinking it would solve the issue, but the behavior stayed the same because the structure underneath hadn't changed. After adding this layer, that behavior begins to adjust. Water starts to move more evenly. Instead of rushing through or being blocked, it spreads gradually. It reaches areas that were previously dry. It doesn't concentrate in one place or disappear too quickly. The movement becomes balanced, steady, and consistent. This alone changes how the soil interacts with moisture. The soil begins to hold that moisture differently. It doesn't become heavy or overly wet. It doesn't turn into something dense or difficult to manage. Instead, it retains just enough to stay supportive. Moisture becomes something that stays available rather than something that comes and goes too quickly. Then the texture begins to shift. This change is subtle at first, but it becomes more noticeable over time. Soil that once felt tight and compact starts to loosen. It doesn't break apart instantly, but it becomes easier to work with. When you touch it, it responds differently. It feels softer, more open, less resistant. You begin to notice that it no longer fights against you. It doesn't hold itself together in a rigid way. Instead, it separates more naturally, allowing movement through it. This makes planting easier, watering more effective, and overall handling much simpler. Even this change in texture is not just about convenience. It's a sign that something deeper is happening because underneath all of this, activity begins to increase. This is the part you don't see directly, but it's the part that drives everything else. Small processes that were slowed down or inactive begin to restart. Interactions between elements become more frequent. The soil begins to function as a system again instead of acting like a static material. Life begins to return, not in a dramatic way, not in something that suddenly appears overnight, but in a steady increase in activity beneath the surface. The environment becomes more supportive, conditions become more balanced, the system begins to regulate itself instead of needing constant correction. What makes this important is how it happens. You didn't force it. You didn't add something artificial to make it happen. You simply created the conditions that allow it to happen naturally. And when conditions are right, systems don't need to be pushed. They respond on their own. This is where the real transformation begins, not at the moment you add the layer, but in the days that follow. As everything adjusts beneath the surface, the soil begins to shift from something passive into something active. It starts to support growth instead of limiting it. It becomes more consistent, more stable, more reliable. You may not notice all of it immediately, but you will start to feel the difference. Water behaves differently, texture improves, plants begin to respond in ways that feel more natural and less forced. And once these changes begin, they continue because this is not a temporary effect. It's not something that fades quickly or requires constant reapplication. It's a structural shift, something that alters how the soil behaves over time. That's why it works, not because it creates instant results, but because it builds conditions where results can continue to improve on their own. Compost works because it feeds the system, it adds organic matter, supports life beneath the surface, and helps improve soil over time. That part is true. But there's something important that most people overlook. Feeding the system only works when the system itself is able to function properly. If the structure of your soil is weak, compacted, or unbalanced, then adding compost becomes limited in what it can actually do. It's like placing something valuable into an environment that can't fully use it. The nutrients are there, but the movement isn't. The support is present, but the structure is not ready to handle it. When soil is too compact, everything slows down. Water cannot move freely. Air cannot reach deeper layers. The small processes that depend on space and flow begin to struggle. In that condition, adding compost may help for a short time, but it doesn't solve the deeper issue. It sits on top of a system that still isn't functioning the way it should. This is why many people feel like they need to keep adding more compost, more inputs, more solutions, because the effect never feels complete. It improves something temporarily, but the core problem remains. This layer works in a completely different way. It doesn't focus on feeding the system first. It focuses on restoring how the system operates. Instead of adding more material to the soil, it changes how the soil is structured. It creates space where there was none. It opens pathways that were previously blocked. It allows movement to return, and once movement returns, everything else begins to follow. Water starts to behave differently. Instead of being trapped or lost, it flows through the soil in a balanced way. Air begins to reach areas that were previously closed off. The conditions that support life begin to rebuild themselves naturally. This is the key difference. Compost adds to the system. This layer prepares the system. When the soil has the right structure, it becomes capable of using what's already there. It doesn't depend on constant input to function. It doesn't require repeated additions to maintain balance. It begins to regulate itself. You're not replacing compost. You're not removing its value. You're creating the conditions that allow compost to work the way it was always meant to. Without that structure, compost can only do so much. With it, everything becomes more effective. That's why once this layer is in place, you often need less input, not more, because the system is no longer struggling. It's no longer blocked or restricted. It's open, active, and able to support itself in a more natural way. This is what makes it feel different from other methods. It doesn't rely on constant adding. It doesn't depend on repeated corrections. It doesn't require ongoing adjustment to keep things working. It resets the foundation, and when the foundation is right, everything built on top of it becomes stronger, more stable, and more consistent. Growth improves, not because you forced it, but because the system now supports it. That's the shift most people miss. They focus on what to add instead of understanding what needs to be fixed first. But once you correct the structure, everything else becomes easier. Because now the soil is not something you have to constantly manage. It becomes something that works with you, not against you. The biggest change here isn't the layer itself. It's not the material, not the method, not even the result you get from using it. The real shift happens in how you begin to think about soil. that's where everything changes. Most people approach soil in the same way they approach a problem that needs fixing from the outside. If something isn't working, they assume something is missing. And if something is missing, the solution must be to add more. More nutrients, more products, more effort. This pattern feels logical, and it's been repeated so often that it becomes the default way of thinking. But once you step back and look at how soil actually behaves, a different question starts to form. Instead of asking what to add, you begin to ask something more important. What is preventing this system from working? That question shifts your focus completely. It takes you away from constant input and moves your attention toward understanding the condition of the system itself. Because if something is blocking flow, restricting movement, or limiting interaction beneath the surface, then adding more on top will never fully solve it. Once you see that clearly, everything begins to simplify. You stop chasing one solution after another. You stop searching for the next product that promises better results. You stop layering different methods on top of each other on hoping something will finally work. Instead, you begin to look at the soil as something that already knows how to function, something that doesn't need to be forced, but simply needs the right conditions to operate. This is where the pressure starts to disappear. You realize that you don't need to constantly intervene. You don't need to keep adjusting, correcting, and managing every detail. You don't need to turn soil into something complicated just to make it work, because it was never meant to be complicated in the first place. Your soil doesn't need more effort. It needs the right conditions. That understanding changes how you approach everything that comes next. You begin to see that small adjustments, when they are made in the right place, have a greater impact than large additions applied without understanding. You begin to trust the process instead of trying to control it. And sometimes that's all it takes. One simple layer, one small shift, one change that restores movement and balance instead of adding more weight to something that's already struggling. It doesn't feel dramatic, but the effect it creates runs deeper than most visible solutions. Once you see this happen, even once, it becomes difficult to return to the old way of thinking, because now you understand something that most people overlook completely. Soil is not something you fix by adding more and more into it. It's something you restore by allowing it to function the way it was designed to. That realization stays with you. You begin to recognize patterns more clearly. You start to notice when something is blocked instead of assuming something is missing. You shift from reacting to problems toward understanding their cause, and in doing that, you remove the need for constant correction. This is where real simplicity begins, not in doing less for the sake of ease, but in doing what actually matters instead of everything else, in focusing on the condition that allows the system to support itself rather than trying to support it from the outside again and again. Because once the system is working, it doesn't need to be pushed. It continues quietly, consistently, without forcing anything. And that's the shift most people miss, not because it's hidden, but because they never stop long enough to see it. But once you do, you don't go back, because now you understand the difference between adding more and restoring what already works.